Hello, Bob Wells here, and welcome back to the Undercurrent Stories podcast, where we dive deep into the hidden depths of our world, one fascinating guest at a time. In fact, in today's episode, we're going to be looking at decision-making. Well, not so much which shoes you're going to wear or what to choose on a restaurant menu, but life's big decisions, decisions that we all have to make from time to time, and in particular, love and money. So how can we improve the quality of these decisions? Well, here to help us with some great advice today is Abby Davisson. Abby is a social innovation leader and co-author of the book, Money and Love, an intelligent roadmap for life's biggest decisions. Hello and welcome to Undercurrent Stories, Abby.
Hello, I'm delighted to be here.
It's great to have you on. Before we talk about, I must just mention the book was excellent. I really enjoyed the book. It was one of those books that it would be nice to have read it many years ago.
Well, that is wonderful to hear. And I hear that a lot from readers of all ages. And so you are not alone. Even readers in, their early 20s say, I wish I'd had it just a few years ago when I was deciding, where to go to university or, whether or not to move to this new city. But I say it's never too late to incorporate lessons learned. I am a lifelong learner. I imagine many of your listeners are as well. So let's get to it because we can share wisdom with folks at whatever stage they are in life.
Well, thank you for that. But anyway, before we talk about the life's big decisions, could you just tell us a bit about yourself, please, Abby? And, your life's journey and what drew you to become a social innovation leader and then sort of inspired you to write the book?
Well, my mother was a librarian and my father was a public health executive. And so I like to say I was born with a book in my hand and a desire to help people improve their well-being. And for the first 2 decades or so of my career, that looked like working within organizations to try to help people from that vantage point. So I worked in the public sector in education, in the not-for-profit sector, and then finally in the corporate sector for the global brand Gap Inc., running their foundation. And now it looks like running my own business and helping people from the vantage point of being an author and a speaker and a coach. And I met my co-author, Professor Myra Strober, when I and my then boyfriend, now husband, took her course in graduate school. She is a labor economist, and she taught a course for over 4 decades at Stanford Business School called Work and Family, which is a different way to say money and love, if you will. And we took this class when we were second-year MBA students trying to make big decisions of our own, trying to decide if we should accept jobs in the same city. If we lived in the same city, should we move in together? And the class gave us radical permission to have all sorts of conversations that were very uncomfortable to have, and certainly that I had not had with any previous relationships, even though I had a quite serious relationship before I met my then boyfriend. And the further out we got from the class, we did move in together, we did get married the following year, and the further out we got, we returned as guest speakers, I should say, for almost a decade to Myra's class. And we just realized that the class had really set us up for success, having had some of those foundational conversations before we felt ready. And so when the opportunity arose to help Myra, to be her co-author and write the book so that many more people could benefit from the wisdom of the course, I raised my hand and jumped at the opportunity.
Well, thank you for that. And I guess with the book being about money and love, one of the things that I questioned at the beginning of the book, and since I've read it, I've understood it a bit more, but it'd probably be something very useful for listeners, is balancing the money and love conversations with romance and everything. Because I guess I was brought up, you didn't really discuss money with your, at the time, girlfriend. Because it seemed a bit serious and maybe not something you should speak about. And I just wonder, at what point do you sort of balance that bit and sort of say, well, we really do need to talk about money and some of those other big things like children, etc. Whereabouts in the relationship does that come?
Yeah, well, I should say that you are definitely not alone. Money is more taboo than sex in a lot of our cultures. And in fact, we would be more comfortable talking to a person we were dating about the romantic part of our relationship, the intimate part, than we are about the finance and the numbers. But I think that's part of this fallacy in our culture, that we should really separate decisions about relationships, decisions about who you want to spend your life with, from decisions about our careers and our finances, because we're sort of taught that if you think about money in the context of a relationship, it's materialistic. But the truth is that who you decide to spend your life with has a significant impact on your finances and on your ability to finance a life you want. And conversely, your decisions about your career have significant impacts on your relationships and the health and wellness of your relationship with your significant other, for example. And so one of the light bulb moments for me in my co-authors class was that you should make decisions holistically. You should not separate these two topics because they are so intricately connected. And so before you feel ready in a relationship is actually a good time to bring up money. And the thing is that if you bring it up in the right context, it doesn't have to feel so awkward. So one of the things that I think worked well for my then boyfriend and I, even before we took the class, we had gone on a trip together. We had gone actually over closer to you, to Ireland over the summer. And we had to talk about, what's our budget for this trip? We were both students. So, we didn't have a lot of income. We had worked in different sectors before graduate school, and we were going to work in different sectors after. So, I was on a tighter budget than he was, but we discussed, where should we stay? Should we stay at, we weren't staying in luxury places, but, we weren't right out of college either. So we could, bump up the budget a little bit. We could talk about what kind of restaurants we felt comfortable eating in. So when you introduce it early on, it becomes a bit of a, easier conversation. I like to say it's like building a muscle. And so you wouldn't want to, wait until you're walking down the aisle and then suddenly pick up a 50-pound weight and say, we didn't really talk about a prenup, right? If you've never had that conversation, you want to start with a very lightweight and just kind of flex those muscles when it comes to something like a trip or a concert or a movie or a show, and say, I realize we haven't really talked about money. Can we talk? I'm just curious, what did your family, how did your family treat money when you were growing up? I can tell you, my money stories. And when you sort of do it in a lighthearted way, when it's almost a little bit about your history and background, it can feel more playful, and it can feel just as a different way to dimensionalize the person that you're getting to know, as opposed to something heavy and weighty and that is about, the future with a capital F.
Yeah, I just wonder whether it's a generational thing. I mean, I'm what I would call one of the last baby boomers generation. So a young baby boomer. And I was raised to say, if I took a girl out for a meal, it would be me paying, and I'd feel quite comfortable about that. And I think that was most of my friends at the time, that was the way that they were brought up. And I think that it was the end of the generation where you got married and the man was supposed to be the breadwinner. The lady stayed at home to raise the kids. So I wonder whether the money thing was discussed then, or whether it's something that's sort of come on with people that are younger than me over the years. Abby?
I think you're right. The trends really are that Gen Z, folks who are kind of coming up today are discussing money earlier. You're absolutely right that the social norms have changed. And that's, partly due to technology, right? We have social media now. We have things like Venmo, which allow you to, split a bill very easily when you're going out to eat with someone. That didn't exist in your generation. And there's also, social media, I think, normalizes. Well, first of all, it does a lot of things, but one of the things it does is normalize being a little bit more transparent about what's going on with you. And so this trend of, for example, loud budgeting that had, gone on TikTok where people say, I'm not comfortable spending, this much money on a meal. Say everyone's going out to treat someone to their birthday, and the birthday girl or boy picks a very expensive restaurant, and someone says, I just get laid off from my job. I'm not comfortable going out to eat at that restaurant. I'd love to join if you can pick a less expensive one, but if not, let's go out, just the two of us, to celebrate. And so people have been talking about loud budgeting on social media, and it starts to then work its way into the culture where someone actually then says, oh, if I saw this person on social media saying they're budgeting out loud with friends, then I can do it too. And that has, I think, helped to normalize that type of transparency.
Yeah, normalized, made it more transparent and brought it out into the open, which I think is probably a good thing. Tell us about the System 1 and System 2 thinking, because that's something that comes up very early in the book. I was intrigued by that. Could you just tell listeners about that, please?
Yeah, this is a concept that Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman came up with in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, that there are two systems of thinking and therefore two systems of how we make decisions. And System 1 is a more automatic system. It is quicker to access, and it's more emotional. This is the system that gets activated, for example, if you're being chased by a predator, right? Our early ancestors. You don't have to sit there and say, should I run? Should I, try to hide? It's like you just, that people have an instinct of fight, flight, or freeze, and that system is the system that decides that. System 2, on the other hand, is more logical. It's more rational. It is harder to access, but it is the way that we are able to do higher level thinking in if you will. And so that's the system when you're making these types of big life decisions that you really do want to access, because it allows for more nuance. It allows for more holding different truths at one time, multiple bottom lines, if you will. And so much of what we're trying to do in the book is help people, provide people a framework and a set of steps to follow in order to access System 2 thinking, because we've all been in those situations where, our boss says something to us and we immediately have this emotional response and we're like, I just want to quit. Like, this is just not, where I want to be. But that doesn't serve us well. And when we make decisions from a System 1 place, from a very emotional place, oftentimes those are the decisions that when you have a bit of distance, we tend to regret. So we're really trying to move people from System 1 to System 2.
Yeah. I mean, I've often found it's if you're weighing a lot of things up and you can't reach a decision, sometimes if you sleep on it or go for a walk, it comes to you.
Yes, and we all have a different tendency when it comes to making big decisions. And we have a quiz on our website, moneylovebook.com, that can help people, if they don't already have a sense of what type of decision maker they are, to get a sense of that. But there are people who do operate from a place of being much more gut trusting and intuitive decision makers. And so sometimes that sleep on it prompt is helpful, because then once they can access that inner knowledge, they can sort of have a sense of what they want to do. There are other people that are much more kind of analytical, and they are the ones who are going to have 10 spreadsheets open, different tabs with all the pros and cons. They want to get every piece of information before they make a decision, and that's there are pros and cons of that. I'm sure those people have done a very lengthy tallying of those pros and cons. And then there are people who are more kind of balanced in the middle. And that's, there's no right way or wrong way. There are just different ways. And once you know your tendency, you can put some guardrails in place in order to not tip over into analysis paralysis if you're prone to that type of analytical thinking, and to take a little bit more time if you're prone to trusting your gut, to make sure that you're turning over the right rocks in order to make a decision that is informed and that has a bit more perspective.
Hi, it's Bob here. Just a quick interlude. Hope you're enjoying this episode. And if you would like to hear more interesting interviews, we have over 120 episodes to date with many fascinating guests talking about a wide variety of topics, which include music, history, philosophy, fitness, food and drink, adventure,
contemporary culture, and many, many more. I'm sure there's something that you'd really enjoy. So all you need to do is just visit undercurrentstories.com or search Undercurrent Stories in any of the podcast platforms. And now back to the show.
I remember once watching a TV program, and it was a young couple. They must have been in their mid to late 20s, and they lived in England, and they decided to go to France and open a fishery. So they bought this lovely little place in France. I think it was in the Dordogne, and it had a lovely lake. But they were extremely naive, and it actually turned out quite successful. And it sort of got me thinking. I was actually thinking of that story when I read the book, and I was sort of thinking, in some ways, it's quite nice to almost have a little bit of naivety, and maybe not think everything through, so that you can go on that journey and make some discoveries on the way. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, some people say, so there's no room for spontaneity in life, that, you're supposed to plan everything out. And I don't think that's true. I certainly think that sometimes there's a role role for intuition in life. And we can talk about, if we want to talk about the framework, we can talk about where that fits in.
Yeah, love to.
And I certainly think that, there are ways to, once you make a decision, if you buy that place in France, then your role is to make it work. It's not to second guess it and say, well, should we have, bought this place and wring your hands for years. It's just, no, like you've made the decision, and your job is to make that decision right. I will say, though, there are a lot of people who bought property, for example, during the pandemic. Maybe it was really appealing to run a farm, have all these acres and just be away from the city where it just seemed so dense and maybe unsafe. And suddenly, people who have no knowledge and business running a farm suddenly realize all the work that's involved, and they think, wow, this seemed like such a romantic idea, and now we haven't the faintest clue, and now we're in charge of all these animals, and suddenly have to learn a lot. And for some people, that's great. They can adjust, they can adapt, and it becomes part of the adventure. But other people, I think they really do second guess themselves and say, oh, wow, we really, did not think this through, and we really just made this decision because we were coming from a place of fear. And so it's, I think personality plays a big role in it. And also, well, what makes good for good television, right? It's sort of, thinking that you have more information than the people who are going through it. And then finding out, oh, actually, this all is going to work out, and it's a happy story in the end. So there's a lot of elements there.
Yeah. I love the 5 C's framework, which was almost like a sort of method of distilling information into your decision. So perhaps you'd be kind enough to talk us through the 5 C's framework.
Yes, and the framework was not part of the course initially. When my co-author taught it, we developed it together from our research and from the desire to give people a way to approach big life decisions, because we certainly didn't purport to want to tell them what to do. That's a very personal, individual decision, and we certainly, weren't equipped to do that for all the readers, but we did want to give people a sense of what the evidence says makes for a good decision. And so we came up with ours, as you mentioned, it's called the 5 C's, and I can run through it from a high level quickly. But the first C is to clarify what's most important to you. The second is to communicate, so to open up a dialogue with the other person or people who are most affected by the decision. The third is to consider a broad range of choices. So when you broaden your perspective, you increase the available options in your consideration set. The fourth C is to check in with trusted resources. And the fifth C is to explore likely consequences, really weighing the short-term and long-term effects of different choices.
Well, thank you for that. And it's nice the way that you can use that. I mean, you talk about the various themes of life, going through life, i.e. deciding to get married, deciding to have children, deciding where to live, and then even going right up to people who are in the latter stages of life or post-retirement, and all the decisions that need to be made in terms of where they're going to live, looking after old parents, kids moving away and all that sort of stuff. I was wondering if we could just take maybe just one of those topics, and just go through the 5 C's. One of those topics of a choice of yours. Abby?
Yeah. We did a large research survey as part of the research we did for the book. And the number one decision that came up again and again, I think, which makes sense given how often it comes up in our own lives, is moving. Because unlike decisions to get married or have children, these are decisions around where to live and when to move that come up throughout your life. This is not just, people move, much more frequently on average than they get married or than they have children. And so that is a one that certainly both my co-author and I were personally grappling with as we were writing the book, and actually since the book has been out. And so I'm happy to talk through that. And it actually, I think, will illustrate one of the tenets of the framework, which is that it is not a linear framework. It is a very iterative, and the way that it works sometimes is that it is you get more information and it causes you to re-clarify what you thought was most important to you. So I'm happy to share that.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. So when we were writing the book, it was actually the height of the pandemic, and my family lives in San Francisco in a small footprint home. And at the time, my husband and I had our kids were 4 and 7, so quite young. And they had been, going to preschool and to first grade. And all of a sudden they were in our dining room as their one-room schoolhouse. And my husband and I were trying to do our jobs suddenly remotely from different rooms in our home that were not ever intended to be offices. And so, this went on for a year or so, and it just became, very untenable. We had tutors coming in to help our kids be on Zoom school, and so we could again do our jobs and not have to constantly switch between our meetings and their meetings. And so we thought, we clarified that what we really wanted was more space so that we were not all on top of each other at one time. And we wanted schools that were open. San Francisco took a very conservative approach to reopening schools. And so it was actually the largest urban school district in the United States that was remote for the longest. And so we had been communicating about this idea of, moving out of the city to the suburbs from before the pandemic started. But I would say the pandemic really turned it up to a boil. And what we learned is that we were having these conversations at not ideal times. So, for example, when we were brushing our teeth to go to bed at night, one of us would say, I saw this house, in the suburbs that looked interesting. Maybe we should go check it out. And, suddenly this other person is like, wait a minute, I was just about to try to wind down and go to bed. And now we're kind of when these topics come up. But we realized that communication, and we talk about this in the book, is just as much about finding the right time and place to have these discussions as it is, what you say. So we eventually started having conversations about moving on hikes, which was one of the activities that was available to us at that time. We would let our kids run up ahead, and then the two of us would start talking about this topic. And it turned out that when we were side by side, we were walking in the same direction, it was easier to be vulnerable with each other. It was easier to talk about these conversations than it was, sitting across the table from each other or, kind of staring at each other when we were brushing our teeth. So we shifted the way we communicated. We considered a range of choices in terms of places we could move. We looked at suburbs that were, my father lives nearby, so we kind of narrowed it down to one that was near him. And we checked in with friends who had made the move, with real estate agents. And one of the things that we checked in with, because I was actually writing the chapter on moving at the same time, so it was very much me search, was a published study that had been published in the Journal of Environmental Psychology about the effect of home size, really density, so the square footage per person, on family harmony. And that article was very interesting because it really underlined that, more than the specific amount of square feet, it was the family's perception of their home that made a much bigger difference than the actual square footage. And so if the family is always, complaining about how small their home is and it really doesn't have, enough space for everyone, then that would really make a big difference. If the family felt like the home was fit for purpose and that everyone had a bit of a space that they could use when they needed it, then it actually mitigated any crowding that was in reality happening. And so that was very interesting. So I sort of said, I think that all of our, complaining about this is making this worse. So let's really, talk about the consequences.
I think you mentioned it in the book, a word called lagon, if it's pronounced, which is a Swedish word, which is just enough, as I remember it, just enough for what your requirements are. And the example you used was that if you are going to go and buy a dining room table, for example, and you've got 4 in the family, then buy a dining room table for 4 in the family. Don't buy a dining room table for 10 people that you may use once or twice a year with the extended family.
Your recall skills are very impressive indeed. Yes, that is the example that you can always pull up a card table when it's time to, make a bigger table for, a holiday celebration, if you will. But yes, that's exactly right.
I think the long and the short of it was you may not need as much space as you first think.
Yes, and certainly that our society has, told us we should have. And actually, that's ultimately what we realized. But what made us realize that was, the published study was interesting. But what really drove the point home for us was when we started to consider the consequences and do the math. And, we both have MBAs, right? So we're modeling out, here's the increased mortgage, here's the increased loan we would take out. And we realized that one of the consequences of getting, what we thought we wanted, which was more space in a suburb that had schools that were open, was that it would actually tether us to our corporate jobs for much longer, because we would be required to work and to earn higher salaries in order to be in that space. And what we realized is that actually we cared more about employment flexibility. We had both wanted to start our own ventures, and we didn't want to wait, 30 more years to be able to do that until we had, made a dent in the mortgage. And so we reclarified at that point that what we wanted was to have career flexibility, and that we, knew that the pandemic could not go on, forever, and eventually our kids would go back to school. And so we decided to stay. And what was so interesting is that when we made that decision, we still, we didn't get any more space, and, our kids were still at home learning remotely, but we started to think more creatively about our choices. And so we thought, okay, well, we've decided to stay, but we still want the more space and the schools that are open. So we actually did new work, and I tried to identify an office that I could rent, a space outside my home that I'd be able to go to in order to work. So I wouldn't be in my boy's bedroom with Lego bricks under my feet every day, and a space that was not meant to be an office. And then we also looked at the different school options, and we ended up switching my kids to a new school that was open, and that was actually a school that extended into higher grades, so they could stay there a bit longer. And then I rented an office. So I'm talking to you today from an office that's just 7 minutes from my home. It's a room in a nearby apartment that I rent. And we were able to get ultimately what we wanted without moving, but we had to we had to cut off that moving option in order to access the more creative solutions that were available to us.
It's interesting to hear how that sort of almost scientific approach that you went through inevitably led to what that decision was.
Yeah. And I mean, trust me, this was not like a calm scientific, process. No. We were, there were parts there we were very frustrated. There were certainly raised voices. And so, I think one of the questions we get is like, oh, wow, you must be expert at this. Well, one of the reasons you write a book on decision making is that you need it yourself, right? They say that you write the book you most need to read. And so, I have learned so much, and I have, changed the way I approach decisions because of the research that I did in the process of going through this. I am so grateful. We are both so grateful that we did not make the move when we did. But at the time, we were desperate. We were feeling like, we're on top of each other all the time. And so part of it is just now getting more experience, seeing, oh, okay, I see how this works. I see how, talking this through, not always with calm voices, but just being able to persist in those conversations can ultimately pay off.
Something we all hear quite a lot from people, and we might use it ourselves, is, I'll listen to my gut, or I'll listen to my inner voice. And those people would probably, and myself probably sometimes, would go with that immediate sort of gut reaction, because that's what I think it's telling me. How important is that, and how reliable is it?
So I do think gut is incredibly important, and I certainly don't want to imply that you should ignore it. But I think it's only, so I see the place for it in our framework in the check-in stage. So just as you are checking in with other sources of information, maybe people who have faced a similar decision and now have a little bit of experience to speak from, or published research, the gut is one of those sources. It just shouldn't be the only source. It should be, balanced with some external information as well. I think that there is the kind of inside view, if you will, and it's kind of what your internal gut or intuition is telling you, and then there's the outside view, because we are not always the best. We don't always have the best perspective on our own issues and our own challenges, and so getting outside of ourselves and getting information from other people who are more objective and who have expertise in an area that we might not is also important.
What would you say to somebody who needs to make a decision of sorts? It's an important life decision, but they can't quite make it because of other factors. And they seem to be waiting for almost like an epiphany or revelation to them that now's the time to make that decision. Is that something you come across from time to time?
Absolutely. I think there is this sense that if you don't make a decision, you're delaying it and you're gaining time in some way. But it really is that not making a decision is a sort of decision. And it certainly, came up for me, for example, when my husband and I were talking about having children. And when you are faced with the realities of a biological clock and of, complications that can arise when you wait, longer and longer, you realize that just delaying a decision is not escaping it. It's actually making it at a later time, which comes with its own pros and cons. And so, we had this rolling 2-year plan that we got married and we said, okay, well, we'll start a family within 2 years. Well, that 2 years came up and we said, we're not quite ready. Let's wait another 2 years. And, you can't just keep doing that, because ultimately your biology will not cooperate. And so I think for many of these decisions that feel, my co-author has this beautiful image of, you feel as if you're standing at the edge of a really tall diving board and you're sort of waiting for that diving board to get lower. Well, the truth is it's never going to get lower. You will have to jump into, from an uncomfortable height. And so almost better to do that. You have to do it before you feel ready, because if you feel ultimately ready, that decision may not be available to you in the same way anymore. So I will say, that's to the people who say, I'm not ready to make the decision, I'm just going to wait until a time when I do feel ready, that you will not feel ready. And so it's ultimately a leap of faith in a lot of ways.
And what would you say to somebody who they've made that decision and it's probably been several years, perhaps they've been married for 4 or 5 years, 6 years, or they've been in a job and they enjoyed the job, but it's starting to fade. The marriage isn't particularly happy. The job isn't particularly going well. What would you say to somebody in those positions in terms of their decision-making process?
Well, we know that people tend to wait a very long time, in some ways too long, to make big decisions, or they make them too quickly. But for this particular scenario, it sounds like they've waited a long time. And it's interesting because when my co-author taught this class for, over 4 decades, after every session, she would get emails from students saying, thanks to your class, I've actually decided to break up with my partner. I realized, we're not on the same page. We have been kind of in this unhappy situation for a long time. And I realized, life isn't getting any shorter. And based on all the information you shared, I believe there is, a better option out there. And she would write back and say, I'm so sorry. I know it's painful, but, better to do this now when you have so much of your life ahead of you than, when after you have several children and, things get a lot more complicated. So I would say, if you feel, like you've thought about this for a long time, and you believe that it's really, you're waiting for, some epiphany, like you probably already know. Annie Duke has a wonderful book, Quit, that I've read and I recommend. And it's really talking about how we need to destigmatize quitting. We have so many messages that, winners never quit and quitters never win. And that's really not true. That sometimes the best thing that we could do for ourselves is to quit a situation that is not serving us.
One of the subjects that comes in the book is regret. And I guess that sort of follows on from what we were talking about. If if somebody can't make a decision and they go on and on and on with their life, they may end up towards the end of their life with regret. And could you just elaborate on that a little bit? Because you do mention it in the book.
Yeah, I mean, regret is a driver of so much of decision making, right? Either people making a decision because they're afraid that they would regret something if they didn't do it, or people regretting a decision they've made. There is an excellent book that I've actually read since we published the book, Daniel Pink's book, The Power of Regret, and he did a very large research survey of all the types of regrets that people tend to have, and found that the regrets that people have are really things that they did not do. Either not being responsible when it came to education or health or finances, not being bold enough by taking a risk that could have led to growth, not prioritizing family and friends, or not choosing something that was the moral choice, not acting justly. And so, often we think, oh, if I take this big risk, I could regret it. But the research shows exactly the opposite. You will regret the risks that you didn't take. And certainly, there are ways to mitigate them. And part of what we talk about in our framework is how to approximate a choice without actually making it. So trying to get information. But that is, one of this research actually helped me take the risk of leaving my stable corporate job and starting my own venture, because I knew this was one of the decisions that if I looked back at my life and I said, I never, I said I wanted to start something and I never quite did it, I would regret that. So I think being aware of regret can really help us make a choice and sort of time travel, if you will, mentally in a way forward to say, if I look back, what would I regret more, doing the thing or not doing the thing?
If somebody goes through the 5 C's and they make an objective decision, they've looked at everything, and it turns out, say, 3 months later, it was actually the wrong decision. It's not the end of the world, is it?
No, I mean, so many decisions can be undone. I mean, I think pretty much every decision, except for bringing a child into the world, you can in some way reverse. And so that is partly good information to have, is like, oh, you can always undo something. But I really do believe this idea of you can, do the appropriate amount of planning and to go through the 5 C's. But then once you make a choice, your job is to just make that choice right. Meaning, you need to act in a way that assumes it's, you are giving it your best go. Ultimately down the line, yes, you may decide to reverse course or change something in some way, but at least in the, short term to medium term, meaning, at least a couple years in, you really should give it your best shot, because I think that's partly things take time, and I've certainly had to learn that lesson as a relatively new entrepreneur. It's different when, you don't have a team, a legal team, for example, working on your behalf. You're negotiating, a contract, for example, with just, your attorney and another client's attorney. So that's a different scenario. And I think our society, especially with, overnight shipping and, all of these sort of things that technology has introduced, we're expecting things to just the path to be paved so smoothly. And that's not the case. I mean, so many things are just take patience. It's a lesson I need to keep learning over and over again. And I think it's one that we would be well served if we kept in mind.
I'd like to talk about AI in terms of, do you see any benefits in AI for helping make decisions, or do you see that in some ways the way that we're going, it could make life more difficult?
I actually think AI could be very helpful in decision making in terms of being a thought partner. So one of the reasons that communication is so high in our framework, it's the second step, is that it's important that you start to talk to someone to get some of these thoughts that you have out into the world. Certainly. But that, assumes that you've clarified, what you want. Sometimes we don't know what we want. And so, you might think of using AI as a thought partner for the clarify stage, right? So we were saying, okay, here's what I care about. Here's what I don't want to happen. Tell me all the risks and tell me, how I, one example of how this could go right and one example of how this could go wrong. And so then that's, you're sort of feeding that into your own thought process. And you have a bit of you've almost like doing the 5 C's before you start communicating. We don't want to, use AI as a substitute for communicating with the actual person who will be affected by the decision. So you can't mistake it for, your partner, for example. But as a way to just get your thoughts out of your head, for someone who's not, I'm a big journaler, so I like to do that, in the way of journaling. But some people, would rather feel more comfortable, feeding that into AI and having them, share their perspective. I think that's okay. And I would say, whatever works for you. There's no one formula for how to clarify what matters most to you. The important thing is to take the time and really try to tune out a lot of the noise of what society tells us we should want. So that is the one risk, is that because AI is trained on, models with biases, that it's going to be biased. And as long as you are aware of that and you keep that in mind, then, you'll be okay.
But as you say, it's probably a sounding board, and it's like having an assistant to talk to, like you use it in other ways as well.
Yeah, it's like having an overeager intern is how I like to remind myself. It's like you still have to check the sources. You still have to make sure that it's kind of not going to give you something inaccurate, but it's starting from something instead of a blank page.
And did both you and Myra, when you wrote the book, did you, with your research, did it affect any of your own life in terms of how you make decisions? Have you got any examples how it helped?
Yeah, I mean, we both used it, as I mentioned, for moving decisions. Interestingly, we both used the 5 C's for moving decisions. As I just discussed, I did not move as a result of using the 5 C's, and she actually did move. So she went through the 5 C's. Her husband at the time had Parkinson's. He needed a lot of assistance. They had remodeled a home in order to provide a more safe environment for him. But it turned out that it was very small. Ultimately, when you brought in, a 24/7 caregiver, plus Myra was writing the book. And so ultimately she ended up, and then at some point he needed more assistance than could be provided in their home. So he ended up moving into a assisted living facility, and then ended up passing away. And then she used the 5 C's again to decide to move out of her apartment into a continuing care community. And so that was another example of, using the 5 C's, and this required talking to her adult children about the fact that it was going to be an expensive move. And that would mean, that it would affect how much they would inherit. So, not easy discussions to have, but certainly ones that were made easier by knowing that, this, by following the format, frankly, and by saying, I'm trying to be the example. And, it's interesting. You mentioned at the beginning that, it might be better to encounter, this framework earlier in life. Well, Myra and I were giving a talk, in connection with a financial advising firm. And there was a woman there who was in her 90s. And she said, when I first came to this talk, I thought, I've made every decision there is to make. I'm not going to learn anything. And then she realized that she was needing to make complex end of life decisions and have those conversations with her children. And she said, your book is giving me, a way into these conversations that they don't want to have with me. And that, I'm using it to make these difficult decisions myself, and blaming the book when I tell them, that they need to talk to me about this. So I like to say, blame the book. This is an excellent tool to use to have all sorts of difficult conversations.
Yeah, no, I think that's marvelous, and if it can help somebody that age, it's great. And I think for me, the big thing for me, the big takeaway for me, was the communication aspect, particularly relationships, and talking about things fairly early in, not a heavy way, but a frank way, for the benefit of both people in that relationship. So the book, there's a new paperback book coming out, isn't there?
Yes, April 8th, it will be out. And, we're so excited about that. Not every book gets to be a paperback these days. So
Is that in the US and the UK?
Yes, it'll be available in the US and the UK, and same date. And we are thrilled because it's more affordable, it's more portable. It's a great gift for things like weddings and graduations. And so we're thrilled that that option will be available, as well as the ebook and the hardcover.
Well, I wish you well on that. What one piece of advice would you give any listener who's listening and thinking, "Oh, I've got a decision to make"? Maybe not the whole of the 5 C's. What one piece of advice would you give them?
So we were talking before about delaying decision making. There's also a phenomenon of sliding into a decision. So, for example, one of the when my husband and I were in Myra's class and deciding about if we should move in together, there's research that says, at least at that point, there was research that said couples who live together before getting married have higher divorce rates. And partly why that is, when you look into what's underneath that, it's that there are two ways to enter that situation. One is to say, we're already spending most nights together. Your lease is up. Why don't you move in? And, let's just take the next step in our relationship. And we call that sliding into that decision. There's another way to make that decision, which is as if you're making a decision about getting married and taking it very seriously and talking about all the things you would talk about how we're going to share finances, how we're going to share household chores. And that is a much more intentional way to making the decision. It turns out when you make the decision intentionally, when you control for people who approach that decision intentionally, those negative effects go away. So that's a very long way of saying, don't slide, decide.
Well, Abby, this has been a really fascinating conversation. It's been really helpful to hear about some of the advice you've given on decision making, which I think can help us all in our daily lives. My guest today has been Abby Davisson. Abby is a social innovation leader and co-author of the book Money and Love, an intelligent roadmap for life's bigger decisions. And you will find a link on the show notes. Thank you for coming on the show, Abby.
Thank you so much for having me.